Welcome to Baptist history again. Church history. Now we've studied Volume 1 of John T. Christian. We went back and reviewed that thoroughly. And we're at the end of Volume 2. I'm just going to refer to that a little bit. Now, all of you that have heard me teach church history in the past, I've never taught this, what I'm going to teach now, ever. Not from the textbook I'm going to do. This book was given to me by Dud Pointer. He was born in 1898, and this is the book, History of California Southern Baptist. Southern Baptists and Missionary Baptists were one and the same. There wasn't any difference in them at all at that time. It's by Looney. It's called 13 Golden Years. Now we're going to be going to this. Now the thing about this book is that I know the people. Many of the people that are in this book, I know them. I was acquainted with them. Dud Pointer, that founded so many churches, that was born in 1898, that gave this book to me, was the man that introduced me to the presbytery when I was ordained. And you can go back and look at the ordination of Jim Phillips and you will hear his voice. That man was a great missionary and a great man of God and a great Baptist. And he stood for the truth in easy times and in hard times. Now, that's just the introduction to that. Let's go back now. And we studied about William Carey. We studied about the Judsons and Rice. We studied about how that the Baptists in this country began to build colleges and seminaries. How that they suffered so great for many years here, that without them, that we would not have liberty of conscience or freedom of religion at all. What did the Baptists give to you? Number one, they gave you the Bible. There would be no Bible in existence if it hadn't been for Baptists. Because everybody else was trying to do away with the Bible. Islam was trying to do away with the Bible, the Catholic Church tried to do away with the Bible, and finally the Church of England translated their Bible and called it the King James Bible. But then they executed Baptists because they complained about it, that it wasn't accurate. And it was very, 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 what we might call biased. And it still is. I don't know whether a lot of people, a lot of Baptists are King James only, but I'm going to tell you something. King James is not your Bible. That's King James's Bible. That's Church of England's Bible. Your Bible is the Greek and Hebrew. That's what the Baptists were teaching all those years. And we talked about that in England when they got started in England, and they stood for religious liberty. You wouldn't have the Bible if it wasn't for Baptists. You wouldn't have the religious liberty. You would not. People wouldn't know what a real, true New Testament church is if it wasn't for Baptists. But the Lord said, "Thou art Peter, but upon this gigantic foundation rock I'll be building my church, and the gates of hell shall not wrestle her down." And by saying that, the gates of hell would try to wrestle her down. And look what happened. Look at the bloody spots all down here. The bloody spots is Baptist blood all the way through history. So that you could have what you have today. You have a Bible. You have freedom of speech in America. We did have anyway. It's getting a little rough now around the edges. You have the right to bear arms. This was all, when the Constitution of the United States was formed, the Baptists didn't want to sign it because it didn't have freedom of religion and religious conscience. Every state tried. They did have a state church, and you had to be, every person in that state, every citizen was forced to go to that church and pay tithes to that church and attend that church on pain of fines or even death sometimes, and punishment and imprisonment. You wouldn't have any of that freedom without Baptists today. The Presbyterians didn't give it to you, neither did the Catholic Church. Islam doesn't give anybody any freedom at all. But you realize Catholic Church and Islam were the same. John Calvin persecuted Baptists. He killed them. So did Martin Luther. The Church of England did it also. The Methodists came out of the Church of England. You look over here where all these churches came from. Calvin, 1509 to 1564, came out of the Catholic Church. Luther came out of 1483 to 1546. He came out of the Catholic Church. He was an ordained priest. John and Charles Wesley. We talked about John Bunyan the last time, the great, what they might call him, a pilgrim or Baptist. He was a Baptist by what he believed. We have the Methodists, we have the Congregationals, we have the Disciples, we have the Cumberland. We have all of these isms, and even the Jehovah's Witnesses, and all of these are cults. But you know what? Even an atheist needs to bow down and kiss the Baptist foot, because he wouldn't have a right to be an atheist if it wasn't for Baptists. John Gano was a great name. We had Alexander Campbell, was a Baptist in the beginning, and then he started his own people. We have a guy by the name of Parker that started what they called the Hard Shell Baptist. Daniel Parker. We have the schism where the churches, half the Baptist churches in America left and followed Alexander Campbell and the Campbellites, or the Church of Christ, or the Disciples of Christ. We all of the Baptists in America, they began to build churches, and they began to build churches in wilderness. We talked about different people going into the wilderness, how they were freezing out there, how that they lost their loved ones and buried them in the backyard. You know, when you're out in the wilderness like that, you know, you want to think that your loved ones can be in the cemetery someplace where somebody won't bother them, and they'll be there until the Lord comes back. I got an uncle back in Oklahoma, buried in a chicken pen, without a headstone or anything. A little uncle, a little baby boy that died because they couldn't afford medicine and they couldn't afford a casket, so they wrapped him up in a blanket that was so precious. Blankets were precious, and they buried him in the bottom of a chicken pen in the backyard. These Baptists fought for education of preachers, because the preachers educated their people. Maybe the people couldn't even read and write, but the preachers educated them. Many times the preachers were the doctor of the whole congregation. They doctored them. I remember one time, and I know that Brother Ray won't mind me doing this, but I've referred to him many times in my preaching. Ray was a student of mine. He was a gangster, and I led him to the Lord Jesus Christ out in the barrio with bullets flying and everything else. All, you don't know whether you're going to get a drive-by or what. I stepped out there in the yard and we bowed our heads, and he asked the Lord to save his soul. But he went to church, and when I taught church, if you listen to the lessons on there, I taught Western civilization, I taught world history, Baptist history, I taught the Bible, of course. But he was up there in the upper echelon of Bakersfield one time doing some construction work for a woman. And the woman was a teacher at Bakersfield College. And so they were discussing Western civilization and anthropology and things, and anyway, she was so amazed at him, and he could hardly read and write. She said, "Where did you go to college? Where did you learn all of this?" He said, "At my church, from my pastor." Well, that's what happened so many times in the past. The pastors taught everything. The pastor taught everything, and by the way, there weren't any Sunday schools back then. The churches, it was very hard to get Sunday school. Now, we just studied in volume 1 where in England, the Baptists there started Sunday schools where they taught the children how to read and write so they could get out of the big factories and everything. They did the same thing in America. And the thing about it is, in the early days, they talk about how mistreated the blacks were. The Baptists had blacks preaching in their pulpits. And we're going to look at that here in this book. Baptist preaching, or black people preaching in Baptist churches. It was a little hard on some of them. Some of them were racist, of course. But in the South, almost all of those plantations, at least the ones that were believers, the men that were believers, they allowed the black people to have churches, and many times the owners went down and listened to the black Baptist preachers preach. You know, the president of the Confederacy, he owned several plantations, and he allowed his black slaves to go to school and learn how to read and write. And one time during the war, one of his servants came and traveled 200 or 300 miles to him and said, they're going to come and take over the plantation there. What are we going to do? He sat down, I'm going to sit here and I'm going to sign this plantation over to you. And he gave that plantation to his servant. And he said, take care of all of the slaves on that plantation. You take care of them all. It's yours now. Wow. What a deal. They could read and write. There was a recording on YouTube of one of his slaves telling that very story. And all of the things, the white people and the black people all honored him, Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis came all the way out to California, and he started the Camel Project with General Beale up at Lebec, California, and Fort Tejon. And after the Civil War started, then Jefferson Davis was elected president of the South, of the Confederate States. They always thought that the Union was a voluntary union, but Abraham Lincoln said no, and he attacked the South. Now, as I go into this book, as I look at it, I almost brings me to tears, because I lived some of this. I've been in these places. I've known these people. And I'm going to go back here to the camera right now, see if I can straighten it up just a little bit without shocking it too much. Right here, I hope you can see it, maybe. Right there is Shafter Missionary Baptist Church. I preached many times in that church. They called me their preaching pastor. I was basically a pastor. Now, the Shafter Missionary Baptist Church, it was called the Southern Orthodox Missionary Independent Baptist Church, the first Southern Missionary Orthodox Baptist Church of Shafter, California. That's the first church in the Southern Baptist Convention in California. There was one other one before that, and we're going to go into that later. That was in 1853. This one here, the original building of the first Southern Baptist Church of Shafter, where the Southern Baptist General Convention of California was organized by members from 13 churches on the 13th day of September in 1940. That's not just a little while before I was born, not very far. The congregation has since built a beautiful church home. The original building still stands, but the church plans to remove it from the property. Now this, I've preached there. You have been there in that church, Marilyn. Mm-hmm. You've been in that church. I'm going to read this dedication to this book. back of the rapid growth and the development of Southern Baptist work in the Golden West lie the sacrificial labors of a group of men, each of whom has had no more dignified title than general missionary. They have traversed the desert, scaled the Sierras, combed the beaches, searched the valleys as they have won the lost organized churches, spearheaded every worthwhile movement with reckless ambition of all the personal interests that they had spent much of their meager income to cover the cost of literally millions of miles they had driven up and down the land of Christ for Christ's sake. Granting that some of them may have been less effective in their ministry than others. I don't know what that means. I really don't know what that means. It's less effective than others. At the same time, admitting that criticism in some cases was justified, any student of Southern Baptist affairs in California will soon be convinced that the general missionaries have been the pioneers and companions of progress. Therefore, to these gallant defenders and propagators of the faith, this book is affectionately, and I believe appropriately, dedicated. Looney. I'm not going to read every page. In writing the history of California Southern Baptists, no effort has been made to establish Baptist concession. And yet it is. That has been left to the scholars and historians more worthy academic attainments. I have proceeded on the assumption that most of those who will have any interest in the book believe that Baptists are not of human origin, that the doctrines preached by them today have been preached by others to carry in every age and every time since Jesus established his church during his own personal ministry at the seashores of Galilee, not on the day of Pentecost. His personal ministry here on earth, actually my story begins with a 16-year-old German lad who landed in New York Harbor soon after the turn of the 19th century. The contents of this volume center around three things: the churches, the convention, and its board of directors, and the men that brought it into being. No effort has been made to write a detailed history of the various departments. Someone may desire later on to write the history of the Women's Missionary Union. Others may want to write a history of the various associations. Now, we talked about the various associations in Volume 2. In Kentucky, in Indiana, and these were all wildernesses, people. Now, we're going from the wilderness there that had been established down to the western wilderness. You know, I thought west was Texas when I was growing up. And I realized the west and the wild cowboys and all that was California. He said, many of these teachers were the doctors, the lawyers, the pastors, the school teachers of the hall of their flock. The news that gold had been discovered in Sutter's Mill soon spread to Texas, Arkansas, Missouri, and points east without aid of telegraph, telephone, television, fast trains, or jet propulsion. The announcement of electrified the nation's capital through it was not an incandescent lamp in the city. While Congress was taking time out from heated debates over the slavery question to decide what to do about admitting California into statehood, Texas cowhands were turning their herds over to anyone who would look after them, and Maine lumberjacks were heading toward taller timber and bigger trees, and Kentuckians were leaving their tobacco to anyone who would harvest and smoke it, as they all joined the march to California. California. I remember when I was young, I called it California. Others took their politics so serious that they did not want to lose their right to vote, so they waited a year until the slim majority of one vote in the United States Senate in California was admitted into the Union. This swift and dramatic shift to the nation's population to the west was destined to give California's religious and political landscape an immediate facelift. Now, California was Spanish land. California was Spain before. And in Spain, where did the Spanish Armada go? All over the world, establishing and denouncing whatever land they came to. This is the Catholic Church, the Church Catholic. And Pope, this is their land. They claimed it all. So in California, you had Catholics, Catholics, Catholics. They found no difficulty in transforming the back end of a wagon into a pulpit. Stand while the congregation stood and sat on the ground. I preached a sermon right here in Fish Lake Valley from a chuck wagon.
You did?
I sure did. Eventually, the fortress type of mission buildings with their tolling bells gave place to modest, attractive houses of worship from whose windows echoed such hymns as Amazing Grace, Gentle Jesus, Meek and Mild, the Holy Book, Book Divine. It was not unusual 100 years ago for the most of a country Baptist church to form a wagon train and head to the Golden West. The whole church went west. And they took with them their letters from whatever church they were in back there, and they brought their letters with them, and they established churches out here. Sometimes they brought their pastor with them. Many times the preacher accompanied his congregation and their friends on their trek, which often took 6 months. Now, this happened from New York to Illinois, Tennessee, Indiana. The preacher many times followed the whole congregation. And remember the hardships. So we read about these people, and this is the 111th class. We covered a lot of territory, more territory than I ever taught in church history ever before. This is the best that I've ever done. I just hope that God gives me the ability to finish it. Many times the preacher accompanied his congregation and their friends on the trek that often took 6 months. It was a custom to stop on Sunday for divine services as they journeyed across the Santa Fe Trail into Southern California, while other thousands streamed along the Oregon Trail into Oregon, Washington, and Northern California. Without doubt, many of the most able preachers of that day were Southern Baptists. Well, they're the most sound preachers of that day. Now, at Missionary Baptist, well, we're not Southern Baptist. We never were Southern Baptist. Hogwash. You were all Southern Baptists one time. They spit when they speak each other's name today sometimes. And you will see that in this book. And I will call attention to it. I just speak it the way it is. Southern and Missionary Baptists were the same group. They called the Missionary Baptist landmarkers, and they blamed that on Benjamin Marcus Bogard. Benjamin Marcus Bogard didn't coin that term. It was J.R. Graves, Dr. J.R. Graves, that did it, and he was the president of the Southern Baptist Commission, and he preached a sermon back in the 1800s that said, "Remove not the ancient landmarks." That's where you get landmarkism from, not Bogard. Bogard propagated it absolutely. So did Doug Pointer. Without doubt, many of the most able preachers of that day were Southern Baptists. By the way, in California, the most educated preachers in America were Southern Baptists in the state of California. Most of them had seminary degrees. That's what I'm talking about, able. Baptists, and they had many of their former members to preach to on Sunday. Both preachers and laymen brought with them a strong religious faith which they felt obligated to preserve and transplant and propagate in that new land. That's why the ruins of some of California ghost towns are not limited to abandoned store, building, former saloon, blacksmith shop, post office, but added to these were the little building which one time housed a Baptist church. In other cities, where they lived and thrived and grown. The history of the Baptist churches can be traced to the evangelical and missionary fervor of these early day travelers and missionaries and preachers. It should be said to the credit of the American Baptist Home Mission Society that much of help was given to those early Baptist leaders. Generous sums of money from time to time were made available to churches needing buildings. The Southern Baptists built buildings for the churches, but many times they had to, in the contract to do this, they'd say that this church could never be anything but a Southern Baptist church. A Southern Baptist and Missionary Baptist started to split in the 1950s. They started to split in the 1950s over open communion and alien immersion. A Baptist church said, and true Baptist churches still say this today, many Southern Baptists don't believe this today, but they said that baptism, even by immersion from somebody that was not a Baptist church, that did not trace their lineage back to Christ, was not valid. And that to open the communion to just anybody in the congregation, communion is close communion. It's not closed, it's close communion. It means that the people and the members of that church only can partake of the Lord's Supper in that group. These were the two things that made Southern Baptists different from Northern Baptists. Southern Baptists held tenaciously to that very point. They held tenaciously to the point that believed that Baptist churches were by succession all the way back to Christ. I teach that to this day. I don't teach church to church to church, because sometimes, boy, things are lost in history. Baptists were hiding in the swamp of humanity, back in the caves. They couldn't come out. But those churches came all the way there. There's never, according to the promise of Christ in Matthew 16 and 28, 18 through 20, 16, 18 and 28 through 18 through 20, that there would always be a Baptist church in this world until he came back for it. And I believe that, because the Lord said it, and you study Baptist history and you're going to see it. While most of the Baptist work in California was not started by alien immersionists, open communions, and unionizers, obviously the trend was in the direction because of growing sentiment in its favor among Baptists to the north. Northern Baptists. Northern Baptists would accept anybody's baptism. In the meantime, the American Baptist Home Society became less anxious to add churches with building problems unless the membership agreed to receive persons from alien immersions and practice open communion. They began to not pay a missionary unless he allowed open communion or alien immersion in them, but that was a stronghold of Southern Missionary Baptist churches forever. And that's one thing that J.R. Graves in the 1800s, I can't remember exactly when that sermon was preached, but it was in the 1800s when he preached, moved off the ancient Baptist, the ancient landmarks. Now this book is probably one of the most important books that's ever written about Southern Baptists in the state of California. This book is like gold. This book was given to me, this one was given to me by Doug Pointer. He was all over this book. His name's all over this book. Now this book, San Luis Obispo City County Library. Southern Baptist churches built California. They built true churches in California. And right on the front of this book it says, for reference, California, not to be taken from this room. This is so valuable of information in this book. I have never preached directly from this book, only quoted from it before. I've never taught history from it, but we're going to finish it this time. This is where we're going to finish. And it's all over in here, just ever, for reference, not to be taken from this library. All over. And in the front of it, Looney signs it. Right there is the signature. I wish that Doug Pointer would have signed this one for me. But he didn't. He didn't think about it back then. He was an old landmarker. He was an old missionary Baptist preacher. Northern liberalism, while others gave up every tangible source of income from the truth's sake. If they didn't allow alien immersion, they didn't get paid. Many people in the Southern Baptists gave up all of their income because they weren't going to preach anything but the truth. Alien immersion is not baptism. The dissension among Northern Baptists that came about as a direct result of inclusive policy adopted by the Seattle Convention, which keenly felt that among Baptists in California they soon divided into two major camps, liberals and conservatives. Sound like anything today? History repeats itself. So the tragic was dissension in California. Baptist work was soon rent by discord, torn by dissension, and infested with errors. When you stray away from the Bible, error always comes in. When you do anything because it's more convenient, I've seen real missionary Baptist churches turn into Southern Baptist churches and then turn into basically Presbyterian rule. Contrary to Baptist belief, they're not Baptist churches anymore. I was offered a real good place in a Northern Baptist church. They wanted somebody that could teach, that knew the languages. They begged me to go there. But I can't handle Northern Baptist alien immersion or open communion. I went to that church, Maryland. We went there with our daughter. And they brought, this was on Sunday morning now, so missionary Baptists and Southern Baptists at one time didn't practice the Lord's Supper on Sunday morning. It was Sunday evening or Wednesday evening. Supper is the time, at nighttime, you know. The Lord's Supper was instituted by Jesus Christ in the evening. We went there and they brought the tray around to us and I said, no, thank you. And they looked at me so funny. I practice close communion. Always. I never practiced anything else. And I'm not going to either. Period. I wasn't a member of that church. I was a member of another church. I remember when I went from Fish Lake Valley to California, I joined a little church out there. I was a teacher in that church. And they had the Lord's Supper. And brought it to me and I did not take it because I wasn't a member of that church yet. I practice close communion. I didn't say closed communion. So many missionary Baptists, they think they practice closed communion. Closed communion. They practice close communion. They don't know what a closed communion is. In the midst of this tragic confusion, some churches ceased to send messengers to the Northern Conservative Baptist meeting. A few of them became prey of Norris fundamentalism and Bogart landmarkism. Conservatives. J. Frank Norris and Bogart. Yet Bogart's landmarkism came from J.R. Graves, the president of the Southern Baptist Convention. At the same time, the Northern Baptist Convention had looked with favor to the county commission of the Federal Council of Churches and had given encouragement to rationing territory. All right. Now we're going to go back into 1850s here pretty soon. Maybe not in this class, but in one of the classes. In California, the Catholic Church would only allot you to start a church here and there if you were a Northern Baptist, but no Southern Baptist. Now, when the Southern Baptists came to California, then the Northern Baptists, and well to the West Coast, Oregon and Washington and all of them, the Northern Baptists wanted the Southern Baptists to sign a contract that they wouldn't go beyond this territory, that they couldn't start a church in a different territory. That isn't what the Bible says, is it? After you've been cast out, make disciples wherever you go. Preach the word. In early 1894, Oregon Baptists realized that they could never be happy in their fellowship in the Northern Baptist Convention, and therefore many of them sought fellowship with the Southern Baptists and were refused because they had alien immersion. In 1931, John W. Watson, at the time pastor of the Baptist Church in Gloria Gardens, Southern California, that's where I went to the seminary, people. There is a church that started the seminary, California Missionary Baptist Institute. It was at Gloria Gardens. It became First Missionary Baptist Church in Bellflower, California later. This is how dear this is to me. For reference only, don't take this book from this house, from this library, from this building, because it's so rare. I got 2 of them. I gave one away one time. Gloria Gardens in Southern California. This is also Bellflower, California. Thomas B. Hart, pastor of the Baptist Church in Maywood, along with others, sought fellowship with the Southern Baptist forces in Arizona, but were refused. The unfortunate result was that most of these churches fell in line with the program of either Northern or Conservative Baptists, while the church at Gloria Gardens fell to the landmarkers. That's where I was educated. In the midst of this unprecedented confusion, there were some Southern Baptists who did not sell their denominational birthrights for a mess of ecumenical partridge. Now, by the way, the Southern Baptists were not receiving any federal funds. The Northern Baptists were. The Missionary Baptists and all of the Southern Baptists were missionary Baptists. All the Southern Baptists were missionary Baptists. The term missionary Baptist means that they sent out missionaries. They weren't hard-shell Baptists. They weren't the primitive Baptists. They were missionary Southern Baptists, Southern Missionary Baptists. The way they said so many times, the first Southern Orthodox Missionary Baptist Church of whatever town. Instead, they chose to walk their pathway alone with a confident faith in Almighty God, on the day of the triumph would finally come, and that one glorious day there would be an organized Southern Baptist with a kind of program that they had known and loved through the years. That's a story. Now, we're going to go back 100 years. But that's from the next one. And this one's going to be in El Monte, California. Our Father, we send this message out as it is, that I pray that people will understand what they have and how precious it is. Father, you know I've never taught from this book directly like I am now, and I pray that you give me the strength to finish these messages for your honor and glory. Please forgive me where I failed you. In Jesus'